in conversations with some of these AI people, they were basically saying that now that we have that the discovery is true of superposition and this, what it shows us is that there is this, place beyond space-time. Mm-hmm. And there's information there. And so this is information coming to us and it's intelligent. Mm-hmm. And that it doesn't have the same, or it's that the carrier is different, right? So it's not us.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to forget this because we were talking about Tyler. You go to the Vatican Observatory with him.
Yes.
And he has a conversion experience.
Yes.
And so can we talk about that? Because that seems like this profound thing where he bursts into tears and he says, all I want to do, I don't care if I ever go back into the space program. All I want to do is help people.
Yeah, because he was really doing a lot of this. He wasn't really conscious about what he was doing. He was just doing it, right? This was his job. He was doing it since he was really young and he was really good at it. He knew what to do. He knew how to do it. Okay. So then when he met me, I told him what he was doing. And that forced him to start to think about, wait, this has been happening?
Yeah.
And so when we went to the Vatican, this priest comes up to him and then they engage. And then the priest somehow immediately decides that he's going to take on Tyler like a mentor or something.
Yeah.
And he even blesses the project. Yeah, so there's a picture of him blessing the project, which hadn't even been named, or it may have been named. I don't know. It was American Cosmo. He blessed it. He's just a really nice guy. I'm just going to call him Father K.
Cool.
Father K would take us to his chapel, which is outside the Vatican in Rome. And it was at a hospital, and he would take us on his rounds. So we would go to the hospital in the morning, do mass, and then go on his rounds. And he would take us to people who were ill, some of them terminally ill. And he would have us help him give, it's not last rites, but it's a rite of healing to very sick people. And he would do that. And some of the people made a huge impression on Tyler because there was a man who was fairly young and, was there he was terminally ill. And I don't think that Tyler had ever been around somebody, he dedicated their lives basically to other people. I saw that he started to get internal and started to become reflective about himself. And I could feel that this was happening, but I didn't know it was going to happen. I just could sense that something was happening like this. So then that's when we went to the observatory. And in the observatory is the Catholic observatory. It's run by a Jesuit monk who's, an astronomer.
MIT trained.
Yeah. He's really, he and Tyler could have some good conversations, right? So the people that are there and populate the observatory are the kind of people that would be in the space program, but they're super religious. They're Catholic. Mm-hmm. And so I had this feeling that when Tyler met them, that it would be over for him, that he would definitely know that there was something great and truthful and, there was something like a God, right? Actually, strangely enough, the International Space Agency people were there, 30 of them or so, and they were all really young. Yeah. It was a whole thing for the International Space Agency, young astrophysicists and stuff. And they actually knew who Tyler was.
Wow.
Yeah. Because no one knows who he is here. He kind of got overcome with I wouldn't say emotion, but maybe it was emotion. He got overcome with the epic nature of what was happening and of what we were doing. And then he decided to convert. And, here I am doing this, this study for years and years. And then this kind of happens. But also what happens is he changes his idea of what these things are that he's feeling he's getting signals from. So he feels that they're more in line with because we were studying saints who had these experiences, and he was thinking that they're more in line with what they were, experiencing too.
And he comes from a line of, you've talked about Tsiolkovsky, the father of Russian rocketry, or Jack Parsons, who had claimed to be kind of in contact with entities. You know, Werner von Braun would say all sorts of trippy stuff. You know, he was the father of German rocketry, and then went on to run the NASA Saturn project, which took us to the moon. And so, is there something about the history of the American, or just space programs in general, that is more consciousness based than we somehow realize?
The Russian space program was inspired by early rocket scientists like Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who had basically constructed his own cosmic religion or worldview around space. This included a belief that humans would colonize the Milky Way, achieve immortality, regulate the forces of nature at will, and transition our biosphere into a new sphere, a mental network. He also believed humans would achieve time travel. His American counterpart, Jack Parsons, was equally unbounded by convention. He was part of the Pasadena cult OTO, along with Scientology creator L. Ron Hubbard. The two would perform sex magic rituals, and Parsons even received a past life regression in which he was Simon of Magus, a biblical character who used black magic to levitate. All of that is to say, maybe the true history of American and Russian space programs is stranger than meets the eye.
Yes, they were doing some extraordinary types of rituals, and they definitely believed that they were in touch with these beings. They presented them differently. So the Parsons crew, they were way out there. And they were doing this in the LA desert, right? And stuff. And they were doing ritual magic, and they believed that they were in contact with, extraterrestrials and things like that. All right. On the Russian side, though, they were doing the same thing, but it was under a Christian veneer. So Tchaikovsky believed that he was actually in touch with angelic beings, and he talks about it and writes about it, and that these beings are in constant contact with us if we're able to receive their knowledge.
So do you have a sense of the relationship between the secret space programs and religion in its totality? Do you think that these things are two sides of a pyramid that sort of converge at some omega point or something?
Are you asking about the religiosity of the space program? Because there seems to be one.
I am asking that.
Yeah, okay.
Is it sort of a Gnostic religious initiation process, or what?
I'm still trying to figure it out, but I do have some data on it.
Yeah.
So it looks to be, and actually, strangely enough, at the end of one of Tom DeLonge's book, actually, he makes a reference to the gods are still with us. The Greek gods are still with us, which I didn't know about, actually, until about 2 weeks ago. And it was really interesting to hear, because I had just given a talk that I didn't want recorded. I went to New York City and I was giving a talk, and the name of the talk was "The Muse is Real." Okay. I went from the very, first idea of muses, thousands of years ago for the Greeks, and then how they kind of, they never really go away. So even the founding fathers, quote unquote, of our country, like Benjamin Franklin, did you know that they were actually part of a Mason lodge that was a Muse lodge? It was dedicated. Yes.
I knew he was a Freemason. I didn't know he was part of a Muse lodge.
It was like the Seven Sisters.
Wow.
It was a French Muse lodge.
Talk about a guy with a million ideas. He invented the bifocals, a certain type of harpsichord. Famously was involved in electricity experiment. He was a complete polymath, and so was probably tapped into all sorts of ideas.
Isn't that interesting? Well, they knew it to be real. That's what I was saying in my talk, was that it wasn't just something that we think of them today, the muses, and we often think of them as just like motifs or allegories or, but we never actually think of them as something that could be real.
Yeah. Well, the etymology of the word genius is attendant spirit, and it's kind of original.
That's right.
Okay.
A lot of our words come from muse, by the way. Like museums is about in fact, museums were supposed to contain the spirit of the muses. Did you know that?
I didn't know.
Isn't it interesting that we have a lot of museums in DC and a lot of architecture about the muses? Wow. It's everywhere. Well, it's also in the space program. So what I found was that when Tyler would do these launches, there would be a lot of iconography that he didn't actually understand when I met him. I would ask him, I say, why are they using this Greek goddess, And he's like, is that a Greek goddess? It is indeed. And they would use Latin, and they would send it up into space.
Really?
Yeah. And so he said that, and by the way, it wasn't medieval Latin, which is a Catholic form of Latin, a Roman Catholic form. It was like 1st, 2nd century type of Latin, which is Roman Empire Latin. You know, what does this mean? I don't know. Other than that, I think that there's almost like a parallel type of religion that's happening.
Well, we have a mutual friend, Dr. IIA Whitley. You introduced me to her. She's a new friend for me. She's written about in your next book, Encounters, which is an incredible book.
That's right.
And I think what she talks about and writes about and deals with in her professional life is when you talk about space technology, whether it's rocketry or anything else, it's so complicated and it's so hard to get right. Even SpaceX succeeded on its 4th attempt when it was on the verge of failure and bankruptcy, and it was almost like a spiritual reckoning that Elon had to go through where he put half his money in and almost failed, and then it finally worked. And that almost feels like the story again and again. Jack Parsons famously said after he read The Golden Bough by J.G. Fraser, he said, I read that book and I realized science is a form of magic and not vice versa, which no other scientist or engineer would ever say, but it humbled him so much, making rocketry. And so what somebody like IIA Whitley deals with is once you've dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's, the tech is so complex that if there's any sort of mind-matter interaction, you have to get that right too. In the case of space.
That's right. And
so she deals with like the mentality of a fighter pilot. And McDonnell Douglas, which is an aerospace corporation at Wash U in St. Louis, had a parapsychology program. Aerospace was definitely interested in parapsychology at some point.
Yep.
And the dirty little secret about parapsychology is your internal state really dictates how good you are at the thing. It's almost like the book of Acts with Jesus, where you have to reach a certain level spiritually to do well with it.
Yeah, so like your body's an instrument.
Yeah, and it begs this question, because 2017 and on is when the UFO thing really started to become more popular and kind of in the zeitgeist, since Leslie Kean wrote her article about, ATIP and the fact that we even had a UFO program.
Yeah.
But that was the same year that, due to a lawsuit, the Stargate stuff, the psychic spy program was actually sort of wrested from the government and made public. And so there's a part of me that thinks that maybe there's more of an emphasis on nuts and bolts, and actually the more interesting stuff is sort of parapsychological and involves mind over matter and consciousness. But what do you think?
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. So the thing is that, here you have in 2013, I began my study in 2012, do the normal academic search for the space program information, immediately see how much is classified and that I can't do that. And then think, okay, I can do field research, right? And I can learn from people, which is, your next best bet, right? And not that I'm trying to uncover anything, to tell you the truth, because I don't actually care to tell you. I mean, honestly, I didn't go in with any kind of an agenda.
Yeah.
I just went in because I was curious, and I saw that my former research basically, my former research was basically on aerial phenomena and Catholic history, but interpreted as angels and souls from purgatory.
Yeah.
So I've been doing the research. It was post 20th century. And so then I recognized that it was still happening, and I thought, very interesting. And so that's what got me interested in doing that. But I think this whole focus, I don't want to be conspiratorial, but yeah, this whole focus on nuts and bolts takes us away from what I found really to be the case.
And it sounds like they were interested in your work on St. Joseph the Divine, who could levitate, and
very much so.
Other kind of historical figures in Catholic history that could literally levitate. I remember one time I was talking with Hal Puthoff, and he said to me, where I was like going really deep on science and vector and scalar potentials that the, kind of a quantum field breaks down into, and how that could, be the mechanism through which telepathy occurs, or, whatever. And I remember he cuts me off and he goes, or it could be a medieval secret society that knows how to levitate, and they put these metal capsules around them. And I was like, what? Like, that was the weirdest thing he had ever said. And I just remember that forever. Like, it was as if maybe the levitation history that is somehow tied in with the UFO story. And maybe we go down these really deep rabbit holes of science and how to reconcile UFOs with, we talk about Alcubierre, warp drives and whatever, and maybe it's just sort of the human body is somehow way more integral to this.
It seems like it's not just the human body in and of itself, it's like groups of people too. Because I noticed that there was a lot of, so I have, because, I've been a scholar of Catholic history, and I'm in conversation with Hal actually about these very things, about levitation in the past and levitation here and now, and looking at the data, right?
Yeah.
And so what's interesting, and I have looked at so much data. I mean, I have the Joseph of Cupertino records, right?
Yeah.
And been reading them, and they're pretty intense, and it's really difficult to read through the whole thing without coming away saying, heck yeah, that guy levitated, right?
Joseph of Cupertino was a 17th century Franciscan friar that would experience ecstatic visions as a child, and many people witnessed him levitating while participating in Mass. He was deemed holy by many of these witnesses, which the church thought was subversive. Eventually, they imprisoned him in a small cell, forbidding him to join any public gatherings in the community. He had his own strict protocols of asceticism, only eating solid food twice a week and adding bitter powders to all his meals.
And so when I started to look back at some of the research data that I had from my Catholic history stuff, I started to notice the people who were said to have levitated or who received these miraculous interventions and things. They seemed to either be doing protocols, or they were children, or they were somehow childlike, or had a childlike goodness about them. And so I don't know, I haven't concluded anything about this. This is just very initial data collection.
Marty, do you have anything?
Let me see my notes. Just something like in the book while I was listening that you keep coming back to is the idea that you can't take the context outside of the experience of the experiencer, and in a culture and in a moment of time where we're so obsessed on a hyper indexing of data and collecting more and doing more, it was a fresh perspective to really get to fully consider someone's full story and the circumstances that they come with for why they might have had that experience. So that was more of a statement, not a question. Where am I?
But it actually helps me because I was going to bring that up.
Okay, amazing.
So when we look at the history of UAPs here in the States, right? Okay, we've got actually 3 traditions, research traditions. We have the invisible tradition, represented, I would say, by people like Alan Hynek. Okay, so they're in the intelligence community, and there are things going on, and there's research going on, but it's not public at all. It's not transparent for probably good reasons. And then what happens is that you get people like who do it as their hobby. So you get ufology, and it's public facing, and it's public scholarship about UFOs. And then from there, you get academic scholarship. Okay. So you have people like John Mack. John Mack comes along. He's a Harvard University psychiatrist, and he's actually in conversation with Bud Hopkins. He's looking at experiencers. And then what we have is a fourth tradition. All right. And that fourth tradition has just arisen in the last less than 10 years. Okay. And I use myself as an example of it, because you have somebody who stumbles upon something that I'd never thought to study, but recognizes that I've been studying something similar to it, if not it, my entire life, and meets this person named Tyler, who's part of the first tradition, right? The secret tradition. And what happens is a collaboration, and then a transparency that we've never seen before. And so what do we call this fourth tradition? Okay. What do we call this fourth tradition? All right. So what I've tried to do is I tried to say, what kind of tradition would this be? And I thought, the strange thing about it, let me actually talk about the context of it, the research context. We never talk about that. What's the research context? Well, you and I just talked about Jack Parsons and Tchaikovsky in Russia. So we actually talked about the context of them creating something entirely novel that actually does something operational and gets us off of Earth, right? And so I decided to look at my context, the research context between somebody in religious studies and somebody in the Space Force, boom, collaborating almost accidentally, it's emergent.
Yes.
It's an emergent thing. So what comes out of it is completely what people use the term emergence for. You know, something bigger than its parts. Because we're just these kind of parts that come together, right? And all of a sudden we work together and something comes out of it.
Well, that I think brings us to a question, which is like, are we on the verge of an epistemological paradigm shift? Because I think about the Invisible College, which was J. Allen Hynek's group with Jacques Vallée, which is a tongue-in-cheek reference to Robert Boyle's Invisible College, which was kind of at the start of the Enlightenment. They would sort of study science, which at the time was considered heretical and outside of the confines of the church. It was dangerous. And I think about how the Enlightenment started, and there's a good book by Francis Yates about sort of the Rosicrucian roots of the Enlightenment, and the Invisible College is sort of a Rosicrucian
it totally is.
term.
Yeah.
And the goal of Rosicrucianism was sort of to marry the science and the spirit. A lot of the early Enlightenment proponents were also alchemists. And it feels like we are now living in a time where science is, you have kind of Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, like very shrill kind of defenders of the materialist paradigm. And then you have kind of dogmatic religious fundamentalists. And they have bifurcated or cleaved since the Enlightenment. And now emergently they're coming together. Like the fact that a religious studies professor is collaborating with a secret space program person who's a mission controller who's worked on all these missions since the Challenger in the 80s is wild.
Yeah.
And so where are we headed?
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. So I was trying to quantify it today, you know, so to kind of say, well, what can I leave people with? And I thought that's probably not the best thing to do because I'm just a part.
The idea of disclosure, as it's currently happening, being a very colonial concept because it assumes that it's like this newfound, like we're discovering this for the first time. I think when we try to reduce things so much to like the observables that we can write in these specific formats, and we think that the human account of a story is the weakest. I mean, Johnny Harris is really like the weakest scientific measurement is when you actually rely on the human story, and I'm like, but what else do we have?
That's all you have.
Yeah. So, that part was I had never heard that perspective, and it clicked so well. A reflection on
I know. So that's part of also the reason that I wrote it was that disclosure can only happen because the U.S. government has the information, right?
Yes, exactly.
And it's like, really? But you talk to other countries and you talk to people in,
Native American tribes.
Yeah, exactly. Aboriginal Australians, indigenous Australian tribes. And they even have these, you know, different initiation ceremonies for it. Just like you and I talked about the Merkaba tradition, you know, and so I just wanted to put a light on that just to kind of, I don't think I could ever balance out that discourse that's happening now, but I wanted to put it out there.
There is some hubris in saying we are now going through disclosure or whatever.
Yeah.
And it is what frustrates me about sometimes the super anti-UFO people, and often the anti-UFO people like were super pro-UFO, like it's two sides of the same coin. And it's like, you're relying too much on the intel community. Like, cause sometimes people will come after me cause I interview people in that world or whatever. And I'm like, they could flip tomorrow and it wouldn't change my belief in this stuff because I know there's so much outside of what they're talking about. And maybe there are ways in which the government is spinning things, but like, I don't care. There's so much open source knowledge. You're over relying on the government in studying this. And I think Encounters is a really great kind of comprehensive overview of how you can study this outside of official channels.